"Well, I'm glad it's no worse," he told me. "It's a good thing you've got all that hair. A poker's kind of a mean thing away from a fireplace. And so you're pretty sure you didn't drag this in?" "Not if you found it in that corner of the back hall. That's where it was, and close to the wall." "Well, I suppose I've got to go back to the commissioner and tell him I'm running an agricultural show." "3 blades of grass and a piece of stem. That's a hell of a layout to put before anything but a jackass." Chapter 25. I believe that Mother and Annie took turns that night in sitting up with me, but I was in the pleasant lethargy of a small dose of morphia, where the mind suddenly develops enormous dynamic activity, and everything extraneous is so remote as to be non-existent. Pictures succeeded one another with dazzling sharpness and activity. I was helping Margaret Lancaster take Emily into the house, and Margaret was stooping and picking up something from the floor, almost under Lynch's eyes. I was in the upper hall, with a thin line seeping out under the door, and Peggy pointing to it and yelling blood. I was meeting Lydia Talbot on the street, and she was saying in a dazed fashion that she supposed they had stood it as long as they could. I saw Mrs. Dalton going through her house again, and the two of them in the woodshed. I saw the lid of the chest raised and the detective, Sullivan, prodding a sack with his fingertips. I watched Holmes carefully cutting pages out of a book, and after burning them stirring the ashes with his foot. And once again Miss Emily was lying in the bushes, and the street cleaner was saying, "It is as natural to die as to be born." That phase passed rather quickly, but it was followed by one less dramatic but no less sublimated. Hidden motive seemed entirely clear to me while it lasted, the very secret springs of the Crescent's hidden life, love, hate, jealousy and fear. Fear? They were all afraid. I thought of that gathering downstairs earlier in the night. They were terrified. But they were more than afraid. Some common bond of secret knowledge held them together, as it had brought them together. They had sat with their carefully tended hands idle and with their eyes wary and their mouths tight, and although they had gathered voluntarily, there was no real friendliness among them. That was my last thought when I finally fell asleep. I wakened late to a stiff neck and an aching head, to find that Mother was taking a needed sleep and that Annie was beside the bed. "That butler who was working at the Wellingtons, he's downstairs, miss, and he's got a message for you from Mr. Jim." I can't see him like this, Annie. He says it's important, miss. I caught her eye, and I was fairly confident that whatever Herbert Dean might do in the way of helping with our troubles, he had never fooled our servants for a minute. All right, Annie, I said. Give me something to put around me and another pillow. And, please don't waken Mother. Not me, miss, she said, and I caught her eye again. Incurable romantic that she was almost palpitating with excitement. That is how I learned of Herbert Dean's experience of the night before with the bird cage, and while less sinister than my own adventure, it had certain points of interest, to say the least. After he had left me, he had moved quietly along the grapevine path toward the Talbot stable. In the dark pullover sweater and dark trousers that he wore, he was almost invisible, and his rubber-soled shoes made no sound whatever. He had gone perhaps half the way to the Lancasters when he thought he heard a door cautiously closing behind him, and he stopped and listened. He heard nothing more, however, and so he went on. It was after 12 by that time, and the houses were dark save for the lights in Mr. Lancaster's room, and a low one in Margaret's across the hall. He was almost stunned then when, about 50 feet from the woodshed, he fairly collided with a man standing there. He leapt me, he said. I was off guard, of course, and the two of us went down in a heap. I knew in a minute that he had a gun, but he couldn't use it, and I don't know exactly what would have happened if a policeman hadn't heard us and come on the run. Each of us had a death hold on the other, and then the officer pulled a flash and it was George Talbot. George Talbot, I said faintly. George himself and no other. He'd been taking a regular round of the house and grounds, as he'd promised Margaret Lancaster. Luckily I'd had occasion to see him yesterday downtown, and he identified me to the guard so he wouldn't arrest me. Then we got up and I went on about my business. Or tried to. All that had taken time, of course. The officer had never heard of Herbert Dean and was still suspicious, and George had lost a cufflink in the scuffle which had to be found. In the end, however, they went their several ways. After perhaps 10 minutes of delay, George back to the Lancasters, the officer apparently to the street, and he himself toward the Talbots again. The house itself was quiet and dark. He had an impression, however, of a light coming out of the stable, not a flashlight, but apparently matches. The light came, went out, then flared again. Either matches, he said, or somebody shading a flash every minute or two.